The night Kiss walked off stage after selling out Madison Square Garden for the third time in a row, Paul Stanley stood in the wings and felt something he hadn't expected, an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the performance. The show had been flawless. The pyrotechnics had fired exactly on cue, and the arena rock crowd had completely lost their minds from the first song to the last. But Ace Frehley, the man behind the spaceman mask, had spent most of that afternoon in a state that made rehearsal impossible, and Stanley had spent those same hours quietly managing the fallout long before the first guitar chord ever rang out. That was the part no ticket in the building could show you. The gap between what was visible from the front rows and what was actually happening in the rooms behind the stage is where the real story of Kiss lives, and it has been living there for 50 years. Ace Frehley joined Kiss in 1973 as the lead guitarist, and his raw, instinctive playing set him apart immediately from the polished, calculated approach Paul Stanley was building the band around. Tracks like Cold Gin and Shock Me carried a loose, electric quality that no other player in the band could have produced, and rock music fans recognized it without being told why. What those fans didn't see was the friction that same looseness generated in the studio and on the road day after day, across years of recording and touring. Stanley pushed relentlessly for precision, for rehearsals that actually moved the needle, for a professional standard that would hold up under the specific pressure of arena-level performances in front of tens of thousands of people every night. Frehley showed up when he felt like showing up, and when he did, his energy was as likely to derail a session as improve it. The contrast between their working styles wasn't a minor inconvenience to be managed around. It was a structural problem that ran underneath everything the band attempted to build together. By 1979, when Kiss entered the studio to record Dynasty, those cracks had spread far enough that they couldn't be quietly contained anymore. Frehley's substance abuse, which had been an open secret within the band's inner circle for years, had begun actively dictating the terms of every session, determining what could get done on any given day and what simply couldn't. Arguments broke out with a frequency that wore everyone in the room down. Stanley found himself absorbing the frustration on behalf of the entire band, defending a standard of work that Frehley seemed genuinely indifferent to by that point. The album got finished, but the process left marks that didn't fade quickly or without serious consequence for the relationships involved. What made Frehley's situation harder to write off as straightforward unprofessionalism was that his personal life was unraveling along the exact same lines as his professional one. His battles with alcohol addiction and drug dependency extended far beyond any recording studio, straining his marriage until it collapsed entirely in the early 1980s. People who cared about him tried to intervene at different points, and Frehley either couldn't or wouldn't meet them partway. Stanley, watching all of this from inside the band, has spoken in later years about how genuinely difficult it was to witness someone with that level of natural guitar talent refuse every handhold extended to him. The frustration wasn't purely professional, and that distinction mattered more than it might seem. There was something painful in watching it unfold up close, and that pain filtered into the rift between them, even when neither man gave it a name out loud. Gene Simmons, who approached the music industry with the focused intensity of someone building a long-term corporation rather than simply performing in a rock band, found Frehley's attitude even harder to absorb than Stanley did. Simmons had spent years carefully working to transform Kiss from a hard rock act into something closer to a global commercial brand, and he understood that transformation as a natural extension of what the music represented, not a retreat from its spirit. Frehley rejected that reading entirely. Where Simmons saw architectural thinking, Frehley saw the selling out of something that was supposed to be raw and resistant to exactly that kind of calculation. Their disagreements moved beyond creative philosophy into something more personal, with Simmons demanding tight studio discipline and a polished production standard while Frehley pulled hard in the opposite direction, insisting on a looser, more organic recording process that clashed directly with everything Simmons was working to produce. The band operated under that tension for years without ever genuinely resolving it, and the strain was visible to anyone paying close attention to what was happening beneath the surface of their commercial success. Peter Criss, Kiss's original drummer, shared more common ground with Frehley than with either Stanley or Simmons on the surface, and yet the two of them were never exactly steady allies. Both men carried volatile tempers, both were navigating their own substance abuse struggles without much outside support, and when those two personalities collided, the outcomes were rarely quiet or contained. What might have developed into a natural bond between the band's two most rebellious members instead became yet another fault line running through a group already operating under serious internal stress. Their conflicts were genuine and loud, and they added a layer of chaos that made the band's sustained commercial success all the more improbable when you look back at what they were managing internally. Outside of Kiss, Frehley's reputation followed him into every professional relationship he entered in the years that came after. Producers who worked with him during his solo career and fellow musicians who attempted to build projects alongside him consistently found that his unreliability made sustained collaboration almost impossible to maintain over time. Sessions would stall, commitments would go unmet, and the genuine promise of what Frehley could bring to a recording was repeatedly undermined by his inability to show up consistently for the actual work. Music industry circles that had celebrated his guitar contributions to Kiss's classic recordings quietly began treating him as a risk, someone whose talent was undeniable, but whose participation came packaged with costs that were hard to justify when you totaled them up. His relationship with the media followed the same pattern and produced similar outcomes. Simmons understood how to handle the press with deliberate precision, turning every interview into a controlled opportunity to expand the Kiss mythology while keeping journalists close enough to stay interested and engaged. Frehley approached reporters with something close to open hostility, treating questions he disliked as provocations rather than as professional territory to navigate, and responding with a bluntness that made for tense copy and tenser long-term relationships. Critics and entertainment writers began consistently framing him as a self-destructive figure whose talent was being consumed by his own behavior, and the more that narrative circulated, the more Frehley's public conduct seemed to confirm it. The antagonism became a feedback loop that ran for years, and his public image deteriorated in ways that outlasted any single incident that sparked the coverage. Frehley left Kiss in 1982, and Stanley has been honest about the complicated emotional terrain surrounding that moment ever since. The constant friction had drained something that couldn't be rebuilt on any reasonable timeline, and there was real relief when the battles finally stopped. But relief wasn't the complete picture. Frehley's departure also removed something from the band's identity that no other guitarist could replicate or manufacture from scratch. The rebellious, genuinely unpredictable energy that had defined the Spaceman persona, the quality that made certain moments in Kiss performances feel dangerous in a way that studio polish alone can never produce, that was simply gone. The version of Kiss that continued had to find different footing entirely, and the questions about Frehley didn't stop circulating among fans or in the press. Journalists and longtime followers of the band kept returning to the same ground, the rifts between him and Stanley, whether the damage was repairable, what had actually broken past the point of recovery, and what might have been saved with different choices made earlier. Stanley's perspective on Frehley, assembled across decades of interviews and his published memoir, doesn't resolve into anything clean or comfortable to sit with. He acknowledges the guitar work with something that reads like genuine awe even now, because those solos and that stage presence and the way Frehley could make an entire arena feel like the rock music was aimed specifically at them individually, that was real, and Stanley has never minimized it or walked it back under any pressure. Sitting alongside that acknowledgement, though, is the full weight of what the partnership actually cost him personally. Years of managing a situation that never fully stabilized, creative relationships pushed past the point of repair, a working environment that required constant damage control just to function at a basic operational level day to day. For Frehley himself, the legacy carries a different kind of weight and a different kind of unresolved tension. His guitar work on Kiss's early recordings remains the clearest expression of a talent that was genuinely exceptional, and rock music fans who discovered the band through those albums heard something in his playing that nothing else in the catalog quite matched or came close to replacing. The story of his time in the band and the decade that followed reads, though, as a long and difficult accounting of what alcohol addiction and self-sabotage can do to even the most exceptional natural ability when nothing in the pattern changes. The achievements and the destruction ran so closely alongside each other for so long that separating them in any honest telling of the story becomes nearly impossible without doing a disservice to both. What Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley built together, with Gene Simmons and Peter Criss and the full momentum of the arena rock era carrying them forward, is the kind of music that outlasts the arguments surrounding its creation by decades. The Kiss mythology tends to swallow the reality of how it was actually made and what it cost the people involved. But the reality is that two men with genuinely incompatible natures managed, for a significant stretch of years, to produce something that neither of them could have built alone, and that the cost of doing so was steep and unevenly distributed across the people involved, and that the damage lasted long after the partnership dissolved. The music endures without question. The tension that produced it never fully resolved. That's not a comfortable legacy to carry forward into history. It is, however, an honest one.